And here we go again. The Witcher 3 Next Gen update is finally here. A ton of people jumped back into the game to experience what I called a stunning update, to the point where this weekend there's actually a decent chance The Witcher 3 breaks its all-time player peak on Steam. Unfortunately, that may not actually happen, because as many people jumped back into the game, they realized, oh, this is actually a slideshow. As has been discovered that this game has some pretty severe performance issues, most notably on PC, and for some users on console, certain aspects were literally locked from them completely. And immediately following the release of The Witcher 3 Next Gen, there's been comparisons being drawn between this and the Cyberpunk 2077 release disaster. Which, okay, that's almost certainly an exaggeration, but at the same time, there are some pretty serious problems here. So in this video, I want to cover some of the big ones, some of the potential fixes, but CDPR has also begun to respond to some of these problems, even pushing out a 2GB update earlier today. And in this video, we're not only going to talk about some of the pretty big problems The Witcher 3 Next Gen is facing, but also a big problem you are facing: food. And we're going to fix that with today's video sponsor, Factor. Factor is honestly just great. You're going to get a knock at the door, receive a big box like this one. It's going to be filled with a ton of great food that will be ready to eat in literally 2 minutes or less. And you don't even have to use a plate if you don't want to. This is true maximum efficiency. Factor meals are never frozen, and they're actually designed by dietitians for peak nutritional quality, which I definitely need. I was slacking on the vegetable side way too much. And if you do have specific goals, there are a ton of meal preferences. You have options like keto, vegan, or even calorie smart, and in general, they're going to be over 27 meal options each week, so you're never going to get bored. The best part for me is Factor completely removes meal prep and guesswork. I definitely had one of those houses that had that what's for dinner fight every night, but with Factor, you could just open the fridge and you'll have a ton of great choices as to what to eat for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. But perhaps even you are too lazy for the microwave, Factor still has you covered with a bunch of smoothie and even keto shake options to choose from. And yeah, these things rock. I've been drinking them all week. And since you watched this video, I'm going to hook you up. You can use my link or go to go.factor75.com and use code POGJUICEDEC60 for 60% off your first box. Looking back at The Witcher 3, almost immediately after this update went live, users began reporting issues, the single largest of which was performance on PC, as it's pretty rough. There are some players out there who were easily running the game previously with over 100 FPS who now, after downloading the update, turning on some of the new features, just can't run the game. They jump in game to immediately find out it has become a slideshow with ray tracing on, as well as some of the new Ultra Plus settings enabled. Many users describing how things become particularly unplayable once combat actually begins. You can take this example posted by 8K Benchmark. They're using a top-end GPU with an RTX 3080 Ti, and at 1080p with ray tracing and DLSS on, they are struggling to pull 60 FPS, which for a lot of people on high-end PCs would be considered the minimal playable frame rate. At several points during this gameplay, they actually dropped to low 40 FPS. And to put this a bit into perspective, this is a PC that likely cost well over $3,000 and cannot run a game with ray tracing at 60 FPS at 1080p. And even with DLSS, as you go up through some of the resolution settings, you have very similar results. So okay, low FPS is definitely a huge issue. For a lot of people, under 60 FPS is largely unplayable. I definitely would consider myself in that category. Playing a game at 30 FPS after playing a lot of games at 100 FPS just sucks, and it's really quite a jarring change. But for many users, that isn't even the only issue, as let's say you are willing to tough it out. You're going to throw on ray tracing and deal with the lower frame rate because your eyes are visually pleased. Well, they probably won't be visually pleased for that long, as you will also be greeted with a ton of stuttering. This seems to predominantly be an issue on AMD GPUs, but it does have some inconsistent results on who this is actually impacting, and I would say this just makes the game downright unplayable. You can visually see here, the game will just stutter all over, almost to the point where it starts to give me a headache. The culprit here seems to be long frame times. Frame time is basically how long it takes the game to render a frame. A frame being the thing that's shown on screen, the thing you are literally seeing in front of you. So when you have something like 45 FPS, that means you are getting 45 frames per second. But what appears to be happening here in The Witcher 3 is those 45 frames per second are not being evenly rendered over the course of that second. So it looks like some frames are taking longer to render, like let's say one frame takes 0.2 seconds to render, and then the remaining 44 frames are rendered really quickly in the last 0.8 seconds. But since this is inconsistent, since some frames are taking longer to render, you're seeing these stutters in game even though your FPS is remaining relatively consistent, because technically all of the frames are being rendered in 1 second, it's just not evenly across that 1 second. Hopefully this all makes sense. I think the gameplay actually makes it a bit clearer, but overall this is a huge issue. And the very telling part about this is it becomes a complete non-issue with ray tracing off. You can see the frame time rendering on this little graph here, and if you notice, once ray tracing is turned off, it becomes absolutely normal. So all of that alone would probably lead to a fairly controversial game release, but it's still not everything, as one of the other big culprits here seems to be DirectX 12, at least for some people. As some users are recognizing that even without all these other extra and added features, if you just launch The Witcher 3 in DirectX 11 mode versus DirectX 12 mode, you're going to see a huge FPS difference. I think this is one of the clearest posts on the issue from Poco Zytef on Reddit. On the left, they're using DirectX 11 and getting 140 FPS and at near full GPU utilization. Then on the right-hand side, you have DirectX 12 where they're only getting 85 FPS and the GPU is being used even less, but their CPU is being used even more. That's a nearly 60 FPS difference right off the bat, and this becomes particularly pertinent because this is the base layer. You're starting off in DirectX 12 with nearly 60 less FPS, and then you turn on things like ray tracing, which will hurt your FPS even more, bring it even lower. So many users are speculating if this is actually a bad DirectX 12 integration with the next-gen update, and that's actually the cause of a lot of these other problems. This new DirectX 12 version was added with the patch 4.0 update, and CDPR may be able to explain part of the FPS differential. On their known issues post, they describe how DirectX 12 actually has some of the new features, some of the new visual upgrades are on that mode, but when you switch to DirectX 11, some of the new visual upgrades will be automatically turned off. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like it should be that big of a difference. 60 FPS is a ton. And although it's just one example, there's a lot of people that have huge FPS differentials between DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. And of course, the biggest thing here is you could only use ray tracing on DirectX 12. There's been a bunch of Reddit posts speculating and investigating this, and one of the leading theories is that CDPR took perhaps an easier or cheaper approach to getting DirectX 12 into the game, and that ends up being a pretty big issue, and that's why we're seeing so many problems now. But at the same time, this does mean if you're somebody who just wants to play The Witcher 3 with some of the next-gen upgrades, not even ray tracing, you just launch it in DirectX 11 mode and you'll probably have a relatively fine time with decent FPS, and again, some of those upgrades. But one of the really confusing parts about this entire situation is I've been saying a lot of this like it's a rule, like, oh yeah, you're gonna have 60 less FPS, but no, that's not actually consistent, because some people have posted up gameplay comparisons where on DirectX 11 versus DirectX 12, they have almost the same FPS. Some of the problems that are popping up with this game are entirely inconsistent. I mean, in general, it seems like there is going to be problems. If you try and play with ray tracing on, you're going to have low FPS, but then there are some people who are relatively okay for some reason. And it still isn't even all of the issues. I touched on the low GPU utilization earlier, but there are also reports of things like FSR and DLSS not making much of a performance difference, which just sounds wrong. FSR and DLSS are the things that are supposed to give you a relatively large performance boost, especially when using ray tracing. But for some people, they're only getting 5 to 10 FPS more, which shouldn't be the case. Hypothetically, especially with FSR 2.1, you should be getting a larger boost, which is making some wonder if there's not an even further issue there. Some overlays just don't work, like the Steam overlay won't work with the new version on DirectX 12. There's some bugs related to toxicity levels, not in the community, actually in your toxicity in-game. This is seemingly due to a balance change that was done with the update and may have actually bugged out some players' characters, as well as there are just some straight crashes. Some people, when trying to turn on ray tracing, don't even get to see the bad FPS. They just crash immediately. Not bad performance, just no performance. And at the end of the day, something clearly seems to be wrong here. There are a lot of users posting online that have very high-end PCs that just cannot play this update with relatively stable FPS, or even with consistent FPS at a playable FPS. And on one hand, it might just sound like, oh, they're really entitled, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, but then who's this update for? If I can buy a $4,000 PC and still can't play The Witcher 3 Next Gen update, there's only going to be a very small portion of people who actually can play the update. But even outside of just ray tracing, it does seem like there's another just general crashing issue. CDPR does have this on their known issue list and recommends updating your GPU drivers, and they even have low ray tracing performance on their known issue list, but it's only actually applied to Intel GPUs, or at least that's all they list here, which, considering I haven't even highlighted an Intel GPU out of any of the low performance in this video, that definitely seems like a separate issue. Frankly, if you bought an ARC GPU, it seems like having FPS problems is more the norm. But then this brings us to the important question. Am I a big fat liar? I made a video covering the update a few days ago, right before the update went live for everyone. CDPR was kind enough to give me a pre-release copy, and I reported minimal issues. The most notable one was probably some of the pop-in, but otherwise it was just minor bugs, and I was able to get mostly 60 FPS at 4K Ultra with DLSS on. And I think one of the big things here is I was playing on a 4090, I had access to DLSS 3.0, and I was able to play at a relatively stable 60 FPS the vast majority of the time. I mean, just look at this gameplay. I just recorded this. You can see I'm playing at 4K Ultra Plus with DLSS on, and I'm not having stuttering issues, I'm not really having huge FPS drops. I do get occasional frame drops, but it's pretty playable, and I'm honestly loving the game. But even beyond that, there definitely have been some other mixed reports with some people with lower end hardware getting relatively good FPS in some of their review copies. So it's not clear if this is a further issue, was there some kind of problem with a day one patch or something else entirely. Either way, it just seems like there's more going on here, some kind of other issue at play. Which, speaking of other issues at play, that also brings us to consoles. For starters, just outright on the release of this game, if you launched it in DirectX 12 on Steam Deck, it would immediately crash. Thankfully, Valve did swoop in almost immediately and fixed it, so that should work now. For some PS5 players, there was actually a problem where you wouldn't be able to see the expansions on the store and download them. So if you're in certain regions, you just couldn't actually play the game with expansions. But earlier today, CDPR did deploy a 2GB hotfix that does address this, so hopefully you should be able to play the full game now. There's an issue with some users not being able to transfer their PS4 saves to the PS5. It seems like in general, even when this does work, it's a bit of a runaround to transfer saves. Well, there's this post that's really helpful. I'll have a link to it down below. But the crux of this issue is you need to update your old PS4 version of The Witcher 3 to the new next-gen 4.0 update. And then after you update it, you can transfer your saves over to the PS5 version. But for some players, you can't actually update the old PS4 version, or for whatever reason, they're unable to. They're just reporting no option to update the game, and in turn, no ability to transfer their saves. And it seems like some people are reporting this could be due to owning a disc version, or for some other people, it's due to where their region of the game is set. But it definitely seems like a problem. I've seen multiple reports of some people just not being able to transfer their saves, and in turn, they don't really want to try the new version. Although thankfully, outside of that and just a couple of other problems, the console release of The Witcher 3 Next Gen is far smoother and more successful, which of course is quite literally the opposite of what happened with Cyberpunk 2077. But speaking of that, many people are drawing comparisons, mentioning how these notable performance problems on The Witcher 3 Next Gen on PC mark yet another buggy release from CD Projekt Red. I want to make it clear, this doesn't just seem to be a vocal minority. Most threads about the game, if you go on, let's say, Reddit, you're going to find a ton of people reporting performance issues in the comments. This was done almost immediately. As soon as this update went live and public, a lot of these reports flooded in. If you're playing on console, I could see how this could almost look like it's just a vocal minority or people trying to hate on CDPR, but I really don't think that's the issue here. I think there's just a lot of people who are having problems, unfortunately. And it's not even like there's a huge issue with mass review bombing or anything. The game is still getting a ton of positive reviews on PC, and as I mentioned earlier, it could break its all-time player record on Steam this weekend. And I think there's just a fair amount of people who are just not using the maxed out settings because that's the only way they can play and just kind of dealing with it. At the same time, this launch is definitely not nearly as bad as Cyberpunk 2077. Saying these are just as bad is a gross over-exaggeration, but at the same time, it's not great. CDPR had been riding a nice high after Edge Runners and Cyberpunk 2077's newfound success, and then them immediately to be back at a point where they have to put out a tweet like this right after a launch where they mention how they're aware of the problems and working to address them just sucks. And with how the development of this free next-gen update went, you have to wonder if this is a scenario where they just wanted to get it out. If you're not super familiar, The Witcher 3 Next Gen was actually originally being worked on by an outside studio, but then it was delayed, and after that it even had no release date given and was being worked on done in-house by CDPR, that outside studio was no longer working on it, and then they revealed it would come out in 2022, and we found out just at the end of the year that it would barely make that date. With just 2 weeks left in the year, The Witcher 3 Next Gen did drop. So of course, when you look at that development schedule, you wonder if, okay, were there some issues? Should this have been delayed a bit longer to get performance up to par, or were corners cut? So of course the answer to that is we don't really know. We don't know what happened with this, or if some of these issues were well known about before launch and they just launched it anyway, or maybe they just really didn't know. Again, there are plenty of people out there who aren't having as many problems and are able to play the game, seemingly. But at the same time, there are a lot of people with very high-end computers who aren't able to fully experience this next-gen update, which is definitely a shame because I've been loving it. So at the end of the day, I definitely hope CDPR can pull this around, actually get a couple of updates out, and hopefully get performance up to par, or at least address some of these issues, like the stuttering in particular is just brutal. But it does feel like we have yet another situation where we have a release that was perhaps supposed to just be, okay, it's out, we're done, to, oh no, now we have to spend time and resources fixing this, and they kind of have to do it quickly. The holiday break is coming, and I'm sure there's going to be a couple of weeks where a lot of people have off for the holidays. So you do have to hope that they can get some of these issues addressed in the next couple of weeks before that break begins. Either way, those are some of the lingering issues with The Witcher 3 Next Gen. Hopefully you guys found this video informative. Hopefully all of this gets patched and updated as quickly as possible. But with that, as always, again, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.